Native plant gardening, like any type of gardening, can be as simple or complicated as you want to make it. Personally, I don't like doing any more work on my garden projects than is absolutely necessary. And I'm sure that is the same for a lot of you watching this video. A while back on the Backyard Ecology podcast, Shannon spoke with Diboll and Hilary, authors of The Gardener's Guide to Prairie Plants, a wonderful book I'll cover more in a bit. During that discussion, reducing the workload in the native plant garden and letting the plants tell you where they want to grow came up. Let's listen in and see what these native plant experts had to say.
You can create a beautiful perennial garden, an English border garden out of native prairie plants. Absolutely stunning gardens, and just manage them the same way as you would a perennial garden for the most part. Well, a little bit of difference because your prairie gardens typically will have, depending on your style, will typically have a component of grass. And most perennial gardens, even though you've seen a lot more use of grasses in gardens, a lot of people still don't want grasses in their gardens. But grasses are typically an important part of the prairie ecosystem, but it does not mean that they necessarily have to be members of your prairie garden if you want just flowers.
I think grasses are one of those things that you either like them or you don't, but sometimes they grow on you a little bit. And I always fell into the don't category, but they are definitely growing on me, even in the landscape situation.
This is an important aspect of a prairie garden design. And it applies also to prairie meadows where you're using seeds. But one of the great attributes of the prairie gardens is that they have dense fibrous root systems that occupy the surface soil.
Yeah.
And where do weeds become established? They become established in open soil. And the grasses, with their very dense, thick roots, help to occupy the surface soil, thus minimizing the amount of open soil where weed seeds can germinate and grow. So they really do help to control weeds. And as I tell people, make the plants do the work for you. And if you understand, not just the foliar zone, where taller plants can shade out weeds, but also, equally important, if not more so, is the rooting zone. And the average prairie plant has approximately 2/3 of its living biomass, living material, underground. You only see a third of it. In some cases, you may only see 20 to 25% of it above the ground because the rest of it is underground at roots. So you want to understand the root systems and plant them complementary. So, for instance, if you have a tap-rooted plant, like butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, or some of the baptisias, the wild indigos, these often are subject to invasion around their bases because they're taproots and there's nothing surrounding the soil. So you can use low-growing grasses around these species to help control that, but they don't overtop the flowers. They work with them cooperatively. But you want to make sure you use short grasses, not tall grasses, which of course would overtop. So the whole design of a garden when you're working with prairie plants is not just above ground, but important or more so is below ground, which then allows you to have a lower maintenance garden, less subject to invasion by weeds, trees, etc.
Yeah, and I love that idea of letting the plants do the work.
I don't believe in unnecessary work. So if I can figure out a way to do less work and get the same benefits, I'm going to do that. That means you got to do a little planning up front and understand the physiological characteristics. But in our book, we make sure to show people the different types of roots. And then we discuss how do you actually work with these different plants, not only at the foliar level, but at the rooting level when you're designing the garden. So you look at the whole picture from the outset. I always recommend start small and experiment and see what you like and see what works. And remember, even with the best estimates, sometimes a certain plant, even though you think you matched it up to the right situation, sometimes it just doesn't like it there. Even though you've done all the homework and looked at the soils and the drainage and the pH and everything, every once in a while, they just don't want to cooperate. Okay, so don't plant 100 of something, plant 5 or 10 or whatever, and just test them out. And then try different combinations. And that's all part of the fun.
Or sometimes they like it more than you thought that they were going to like it because they didn't read the book as to what they were supposed to do.
That's exactly it. Sometimes the plants forget to read the book. It's so true, isn't it? That's stuff. You make your best estimates, but it's always fascinating to see what the plants actually do. Sometimes they do almost defy you in either their failure or in their incredible success. But that's all in the process.
Like my echinacea purpurea in my garden in Indianapolis that put itself into the shade of a huge silver maple we had there. It migrated from the full sun at the end of the border right up to the top where the shade was. And that's where they stayed. And that was one of the things about working with prairie plants was figuring out that they decide for themselves what's best for them. We can do our best. And as Neil says, you learn about the root systems, you learn about the soil they need, you learn about the light that they need. Do the best we can, but they will then tell us if that's not right.
And a surprising number of prairie plants will grow in partial shade. In fact, many of them grow in savannas and woodland edges.
Yep.
So there's a little more flexibility in many of these plants where they'll grow in 50% sun, direct sun, some even less. So they're not necessarily obligate sun plants. Many of them will take a fair amount of shade. So they can be used in a variety of situations. Not deep shade, but partial shade or dapple shade.
Yeah, there's definitely different types of shade, and especially here in the eastern US, those savannas are much more common, I think, than out in some of what we traditionally think of as prairie states out west.
There's a concept that is used commonly in ecology and in forestry, and that is the leaf area index of a given species of tree. Okay, which means basically how many layers of leaves do I have from the top of the tree down to the ground. So oaks tend to have a relatively low leaf area index of 2 to 4, maybe 5, whereas sugar maples have a leaf area index of 7 or 8, which just casts a much higher shade on a scale of 1 to 10. And walnuts tend to be moderately low. Of course, you have the issues of jugworm with walnuts, but a lot of native plants are actually quite resistant to jugworm. But you want to be careful with that one. So you have different levels of shade under different types of trees, different species, because of the density of their leaves or thickness of the layers based upon the canopy down to the ground. And then, of course, as Hilary pointed out, it's the tree that's limbed up. You got a lot of indirect sun, and sometimes direct sun on the south, southeast, or southwest side of the tree. Well, you get a lot of sun. So it's not really in the shade, especially if the tree is limbed up. So there's a lot of flexibility here with a number of these plants.
Exactly. And your advice about starting small is so important too. And I know it's hard sometimes. I'm one of the worst, I would say, about getting overeager and wanting to do everything at once. So I'm always telling the people I'm working with and coaching and teaching and helping, don't do what I do, do what I say. I break the rule on myself all the time, and I know that.
Yes.
And sometimes much to our chagrin, but
Yeah.
that's how we learn. It's always good to learn small and then go big once you know what's going to work best.
While we're on the subject of plant propagation, have you ever planted some native flower seeds, and then when they started to germinate, along with all the various other seeds that were either in your soil or blew in on the wind, you had no idea which were the native sprouts that you had planted? I know you have. So have I. It can be super tough to tell what is what, especially when you're planting new species. If you have been looking for a reference that has pictures of the seedlings of commonly planted natives, I have some good news. The Gardener's Guide to Prairie Plants by Diboll and Cox has just such photographs in it, as well as photos of emerging established perennials, the mature plant, leaves, flowers, and even the seed head, plus a ton of other useful information. It is an excellent book, and I consider it a must-have for any native plant gardener's reference collection. Along with a link to Neil and Hilary's awesome book, I will put a link to the full podcast episode in the description in case you want to listen into some more great native plant gardening advice. Neil mentioned using native grasses to reduce weed competition in the native plant garden, which is a great tip. Another group of native plants that can be used in a similar way are the grass allies known as sedges, and you can learn about how awesome and adaptable they are by watching this video, and be sure to get out and explore nature in your backyard.